She walked down the aisle wearing her sister's dress, holding her breath as the man at the altar blind, since the accident reached for her hand without hesitation. No one questioned it, not even him, but someone should have, because the woman he married that morning wasn't the one he thought he knew. If you believe that sometimes what's hidden holds more truth than what's shown, stay with us. And if this story moves you, leave a thought, like, or share it forward. Trinity Cathedral in downtown Cleveland stood solemn and quiet, its sandstone walls holding centuries of weddings, funerals, and prayers. Today, it was dressed in white lilies and expectations. Rows of guests filled the dark wooden pews. Investors, lawyers, old money families from Shaker Heights and Pepper Pike, all invited to witness the marriage of Julian Westbrook, heir to one of Ohio's oldest private equity firms, and Sabrina Monroe, daughter of a once prestigious family, now living behind closed doors and quiet debts. But the woman walking down the aisle was not Sabrina. No one noticed. Not the priest, not the guests, not even the camera crew hired to capture every moment. They saw the veil, the gown, the name printed on the program, but they didn't see her. Not really. Eliza Monroe could barely feel her feet as she stepped into the cathedral's long nave, her mother's hand tightening briefly around her wrist before letting go. "This is what we need, Eliza, for all of us," her mother had said, zipping up the lace dress with trembling fingers just minutes before. She'd said nothing in return. Julian Westbrook waited at the altar with a calm face and hands folded gently in front of him. He stood straight, practiced. He couldn't see the woman approaching, but he turned his face slightly toward her, like he could sense something through the echo of her footsteps on the stone floor. Eliza walked toward him, every inch of her skin burning beneath silk. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to speak. Her job was to wear the dress, say the vows, and sign the papers. Just until Sabrina came back. Just until the money cleared. The ceremony was brief. The priest spoke with the clipped rhythm of someone paid to be efficient. Eliza's voice shook when she said, "I do," barely audible under the organ's soft swell. She didn't look up once. Julian held her hand gently as they were pronounced husband and wife. His fingers brushed hers, warm, steady, but she felt the pause in his grip, like he was waiting for something that didn't come. The reception that followed was private, sparse. Only close associates were invited to the dining room at Westbrook Manor, where champagne was served but barely sipped. Sabrina was absent. Her name floated through whispered conversations like a perfume someone had forgotten to wear. In their suite that evening, Eliza stood at the edge of the room. The dress was too long. The veil had been taken off. Her makeup had cracked around the edges. She looked like a girl wearing a costume too heavy for her frame. Julian sat in a high-backed chair near the fireplace. His eyes, clouded and unfocused, were turned toward the window, where light from the garden flickered against the glass. "You're quiet," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, unrushed. "I've met quiet people, but yours sounds like it's hiding." She didn't respond. Her hands clenched the back of a chair across the room, knuckles pale against the dark wood. He shifted slightly, facing her. "You smell different." Her throat tightened. "Not in a bad way," he added, calmly, "just different. Sabrina used citrus perfume. You wear something softer, like cedar and something else. Rain. Maybe." She swallowed hard, suddenly aware that the space between them wasn't as dark as she thought. "I don't need eyes to know when something's off," he said. "I hear it. In people's breaths, in pauses, in how a hand moves, how a word lands." Eliza took a step back, just one. He didn't move. Then came the question, gentle but exacting. "Are you afraid I'll see you?" The silence that followed was loud. She didn't answer. She wasn't ready for truth. Not here. Not like this. She wasn't even sure what truth meant anymore. She only knew that her body didn't feel like hers in this dress, and that his words had reached something beneath her ribs. Julian stood slowly. No cane. No assistance. He walked past her, unhurried, as if he'd memorized the room already. At the door, he paused. I'm not angry, he said, but I'm listening. He left her there, in the middle of a room that wasn't hers, wearing a name that wasn't hers, in a life she never asked for. She sank slowly onto the edge of the bed, letting the silence press in from all sides. Outside, the garden lights dimmed. The house grew quiet. She didn't know what would happen tomorrow, but something in the way he spoke low, certain, unfinished, made her realize this wasn't a transaction anymore. She didn't move, but deep inside, something already had. The morning light poured into Westbrook Manor like a polite guest, soft, filtered through high windows, not asking too many questions. Eliza sat curled in one of the library chairs, a leather-bound journal open across her knees. Her hands rested still on the pages, though she'd stopped reading long ago. The book was Sabrina's. Notes scribbled in slanted cursive described Julian's routines, his habits, his preferences in sound textures, temperature, spacing. It read less like affection and more like instructions. A manual for a life Eliza was now expected to impersonate. Outside, the garden remained frosted from the night before. Branches held their breath. Inside, Eliza practiced how to become her sister. She memorized the tea he preferred white jasmine in the morning, no sugar. She practiced smiling when the housekeeper said, "Mrs. Westbrook," though it felt like glass in her throat every time. She even tried on Sabrina's perfume. It didn't last long. The scent felt too loud on her skin, like shouting with no voice. Upstairs, Julian walked the halls with care. He didn't use his cane in familiar spaces, choosing instead to map the world with memory and the echo of his own footsteps. His hand moved gently along the wallpaper seams, the edge of the door frames, the grain in the wooden stair rail. The house was quiet, but his mind was not. Each room whispered something he couldn't quite name, especially now. In a back room near the dining hall, Eliza's mother and Sabrina were already running numbers. Their conversation was all whispers and clipped confidence. The Westbrook Trust had been accessed. The first transfer would stabilize what was left of Monroe Interiors, the company their father built, and watched collapse. "Just keep your head down for 6 months, their mother said. "Then we can talk options." "She's not going to last 6, Sabrina muttered, flicking open her phone. "She doesn't have to," came the reply. "She just has to stay useful." Eliza didn't hear them. She was in the music room by then, trying to identify each framed photo on the wall by touch alone. Faces of men in suits, award nights, foundation plaques, the Westbrook legacy, captured in still smiles and gold embossing. That afternoon, Julian found her in the hallway near the piano. She had just placed a metronome on the windowsill, unsure if he used it anymore. He stood quietly behind her, hands in his pockets, waiting for her to notice. She turned, startled but composed. "You're careful," he said. "With what? With everything." She forced a small smile. "You're observant." "I have to be," he said. "It's the only way I know when someone's lying." She froze, just a beat. Then she turned back toward the metronome, winding it once before stopping halfway. Julian moved closer, his steps slow, deliberate. "You pause every time I say, 'my wife,' like you're trying to decide if you should answer." Eliza said nothing. Her hand dropped from the metronome. He tilted his head, listening. "You don't have to explain. I just wonder what you hear when I say it. Is it shame, or is it something else?" She still didn't answer. Later that night, after dinner, where neither of them said much, Julian appeared outside her bedroom door. His knock was soft, 2 taps, evenly spaced. She opened the door only part way, her hair tied loosely, a sweater thrown over her shoulders. He didn't step inside. He just rested his hand gently on the doorframe. "I'm going to the sound lab tomorrow," he said. "I'd like you to come." "Why?" "Because there are things I still understand better through someone else's silence." Eliza looked at him. The hallway light left most of his face in shadow, but there was a stillness in his posture, not cold, just waiting. No pressure, no threat, but not nothing. "I don't know anything about sound labs," she said quietly. "That's not what I'm asking." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the door. Okay. He nodded once and turned. She watched him walk away, each step calm, confident in its path. The hallway stretched long and narrow before him, but he never missed a beat. She didn't close the door for a long time after that, just stood there, the handle warm in her hand, wondering how many more names she would have to wear before someone asked her who she was underneath. The Westbrook Acoustic Lab sat in a low brick building in East Cleveland, tucked behind a stretch of overgrown parking lots and aging warehouses. From the outside, it looked like a remnant of the past. No glass walls, no chrome, just brick and shadow. But inside, everything was precision, the kind of silence that hummed with intention. No hum of air vents, no ticking clocks, just space, clean and waiting. Julian walked ahead of Eliza with an ease that didn't match the starkness of the room. His hand brushed along the edge of the soundproof glass as if confirming its shape. She followed at a slower pace, unsure of what to do with her hands, her eyes, her presence. A technician nodded respectfully as they entered, then disappeared into a side hallway. "This is where I work," Julian said simply, his voice low but clear, or, at least, where I remember how to hear. They stepped into a narrow control room, where a panel of dials blinked in soft amber and green. Behind it was a booth lined in foam, perfectly sealed. A place meant to erase the outside world, so what remained could be trusted. Julian gestured toward a chair. "Sit," he said. "Just listen." Eliza slipped on the headphones the technician had left out. The sound that met her was faint, at first rhythmic, low, like wind brushing across a wide surface. Then, slowly, a deep resonance filled the space. It was water. Lake Erie, she guessed, recorded in the early morning before the city stirred. But it didn't crash or roar. It breathed, like lungs. She removed the headphones carefully, not wanting to break whatever fragile thread had been holding the moment together. "You record water." Julian smiled faintly. "And wind, the hum of power lines, the space between two heartbeats." "Why?" she asked, almost too softly. He sat across from her, folding his hands in his lap. "Because that's how I remember the world. Not by what it shows me, but by what it never meant to reveal." Eliza said nothing. She looked at the wall behind him, where a photograph hung a child at a piano, blurred with motion. Julian turned his head slightly, as if catching her silence like a scent in the room. "Most people hear noise," he continued, "but noise is just detail we never learned to name." She watched him for a moment, not sure how to place this version of him. He was not the man from the wedding photos she'd studied, not the reputation she'd heard whispered about in boardrooms. He was something else here, still powerful, still composed, but human in a way she hadn't expected. It unsettled her, but not in the way she feared. They left the lab in the late afternoon. The air outside had warmed just enough to melt the edges of the previous night's frost. Julian walked slowly, his hand finding the curve of her elbow briefly as they navigated a curb. He didn't speak for a while. When they reached the car, the driver stood waiting, engine idling. "Do you believe," Julian said suddenly, "that truth makes a sound?" Eliza turned to look at him. His face was unreadable as always, but his tone had shifted. Less curious, more specific. "I'm not sure," she replied. He nodded. "I think it does. It's quiet. But it's there. And sometimes, I think I'm hearing it, but I don't want to say it out loud." She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing, but her silence felt different now, less like hiding, more like offering space. They climbed into the car, and the doors closed with a gentle click. The driver pulled onto the main road, weaving through industrial blocks and flickering streetlights. Back at the house, a staff member opened the door and greeted them. "Welcome back, Mr. Westbrook, Miss Monroe." But the name he used, Sabrina, was a slip. He said it too quickly, too confidently. Julian paused. His brow didn't move, but his head turned slightly, as if trying to place the voice behind the words. Eliza let out a small laugh. Too quick. Too practiced. I guess old habits stick, she said to the man. Then she turned to Julian. I'll see you in the library. He gave a slow nod. Yes. She moved ahead of him, steps too careful, too rehearsed. Julian stood still for a moment at the base of the stairs, hand resting lightly on the banister. The man had called her Sabrina, and she hadn't corrected him. Later that night, as Eliza sat alone in her room, she replayed the moment over and over. Her hands rested in her lap, her eyes fixed on the wall where moonlight painted pale squares through the window. In the room beneath her, Julian poured a single glass of water and sat near the fireplace. He didn't drink. He didn't move. He just listened. The rain came quiet at first, just a steady tick on the glass, like time moving in reverse. Outside, the grounds of Westbrook Manor blurred under the gray. Inside, the old basement smelled of dust and paper, shelves stacked with unlabeled boxes and magnetic reels. The lights flickered slightly overhead, not quite broken, not quite stable. Eliza rubbed her palms together as she followed Julian's voice through the storage corridor. This is where we keep the analog, he said, touching the edge of a metal shelf with practiced ease. Before everything went digital, we archived by sound. Tape reels, interviews, test recordings. Years of sound I haven't heard in a long time. Eliza trailed behind, her footsteps echoing softly on the concrete floor. She felt out of place, like she'd wandered into someone else's memory. Julian crouched beside a file cabinet and slid open a drawer. I've been meaning to sort through these, but I'd need a second pair of hands. She knelt beside him without answering. He passed her the first reel. Start with that one. The machine still works mostly. She fitted the tape onto the player, her fingers hesitant but careful. A soft whir filled the room. Then came a series of disjointed tones, tuning forks, and a man's voice, reading calibration numbers. Julian didn't react. He knew this one. They moved through 3 more reels, raw acoustics, archival notes, a conversation between 2 technicians laughing about a broken microphone. Then came a reel marked only with a date, July 19th, 2016. Julian paused. That's the year we started the school program, he said. Could be from the Cleveland trial run. Eliza nodded and clicked the tape into place. The recording began with a pause. Then, a girl's voice filled the air, unpolished, but clear, young, honest. Hi, my name is Eliza Monroe. I'm a student at Lincoln High. I just wanted to say thank you, Mr. Westbrook, for the scholarship. I know I'm not the best musician, but I want to learn, and this gave me a shot. She paused on the recording, then laughed nervously. That's all. I hope I didn't say that weird. Julian didn't move. Eliza's fingers hovered near the stop button. She didn't look at him. Her throat felt tight, as if the words still lived somewhere inside her, caught between the girl she'd been and the woman she was now. Julian exhaled, soft but certain. You said it exactly right. She looked at him then, finally, but he didn't turn his head. His expression didn't shift. He just sat back slowly, hands resting on his knees. You kept that, she asked. I kept every thank you, he replied. But some. I remembered. He stood up, brushing invisible dust from his jacket. It's strange, he added after a beat, how people leave themselves behind, not knowing they'll walk back into their own voice. Eliza didn't know what to say. The reel spun to silence, clicking at its end. Julian reached for it, lifting the tape from the machine with care. His hands knew the rhythm. You've been here before, he said gently, even if I didn't know it until now. Later that evening, they sat across from each other at the dinner table. The conversation was quiet, but less strained. Julian asked her about the books she liked, the sounds she remembered from childhood. She didn't offer much, but when she laughed once, an unguarded, brief sound, he turned his face toward her immediately, as if it were familiar. The next day, while Julian worked in the study, Eliza walked the long corridor toward the music room. She didn't go inside, just stood at the door for a moment, listening to the faint creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. Then she hummed, almost without thinking, a line from a melody she hadn't sung in years. Down the hall, Julian stilled. He didn't say anything, but he smiled, just slightly, as he placed the old reel on the side table and whispered to the empty room, "Thank you for coming back, even if not in the way I expected." 2 weeks had passed since the wedding, and Eliza had begun to move through the corridors of Westbrook Manor without feeling like she was trespassing. She had learned the creaks in the staircase, the way the third tile in the hallway always gave a soft click when stepped on. She rose early, brewed tea before the housekeeper arrived, and spent her mornings in the sunroom, where Julian liked to sit with his hands wrapped around a warm cup, listening to the news through the low murmur of a radio tuned precisely to NPR. They had fallen into a rhythm, not closeness, not yet, but a quiet companionship that neither of them questioned. Julian didn't speak unless he had something worth saying, and Eliza didn't fill the silence unless it ached. Sometimes, their conversations lasted only a few sentences, but there were glances, gestures, the kind that didn't ask for understanding but received it anyway. That Thursday, they drove together to the Cleveland Public Library. Julian had been invited to present a pilot project, a city-funded initiative for sound-based spatial navigation training for the visually impaired. His usual assistant had canceled last minute, and without thinking too long, Eliza had offered to step in. She held the printed speech tightly as they entered the reading room, where rows of folding chairs and microphones waited beneath skylights. The audience wasn't large, mostly educators and staff, but the air felt formal, expectant. Julian sat beside her, his hands folded neatly, his head bowed slightly. "You can read it as is," he said, "but if it doesn't sound like you, change it." Eliza nodded. When her name was called, she stepped to the podium. The microphone adjusted itself with a soft creak. She looked at the paper. Her fingers trembled. Then she read, slowly at first, then with more certainty. She didn't mimic Julian's tone, but let her own voice carry soft, deliberate, occasionally catching in her throat. She spoke of accessibility, of sound as a way to remap the world, of silence, not as loss, but as another kind of awareness. Julian sat still as she spoke, his eyes closed, his expression unreadable. When she finished, there was polite applause. A few heads turned toward Julian, curious, but he only smiled faintly, reaching for his cane, ready to leave. They didn't speak until they stopped for coffee at a small bakery in Tremont, a narrow storefront with green awnings and the smell of vanilla and warm bread wafting into the street. They sat by the window. Julian sipped black coffee. Eliza picked apart a croissant. The owner, a woman in her 60s, approached with a gentle smile. "You've got a beautiful speaking voice," she said to Eliza. "Were you ever a singer?" Julian's head turned slightly. Eliza froze, then gave a polite smile. "No," she said too quickly. "Not really." The woman nodded and left. Julian didn't speak right away, but in the car, as they pulled out of the narrow lot, he asked, almost casually, "You used to sing." Eliza hesitated, then pulled the seatbelt tighter across her chest. It was a long time ago. There was no push in his voice, just a gentle curiosity. But she didn't elaborate, and he didn't ask again, that night, after dinner. Eliza didn't join Julian in the sunroom. Instead, she climbed the narrow stairs to the guest wing and sat at the edge of the bed with her old laptop balanced on her knees. The screen flickered to life, faintly humming. She found the folder easily. It had always been there, untouched for years, a single audio file, time-stamped with the last week of her father's life. She clicked play. The melody filled the room slowly, raw and imperfect, a girl's voice, untrained but sincere, singing words she had written for a man who never got to hear them. Her father had died in a state hospital outside of Youngstown. The treatment they couldn't afford came too late, and the song had stayed sealed in this machine ever since. She listened to it all the way through, her fingers clenched around the sides of the laptop, her eyes burning. She didn't know that Julian stood just beyond her door, one hand resting on the frame, He hadn't intended to listen. He had only come to ask if she wanted tea. But when the music began, he didn't knock. He stayed there, quiet, unmoving. The notes ended. The silence that followed felt heavier than the song itself. Eliza closed the laptop, sat still, and beyond the door. Julian exhaled slowly. He didn't leave. He just let the quiet surround him like something he recognized. The morning light fell softly across the music room, catching on the curved wood of the cello resting in its cradle. Julian sat in the corner, chin tilted slightly upward, fingers gliding along the strings in slow, deliberate motion. Eliza stood nearby, holding a cloth and peg oil, careful not to interrupt the rhythm he moved by one built more from memory than sight. He paused mid-note. "The G string's tight again," he said. "Third position." Eliza stepped forward, crouching beside him. She gently adjusted the fine tuner, then reached to steady the neck. Her left hand brushed his, just briefly, as she realigned the tuning peg. That was when he noticed. "Your finger," he said quietly. "You've got a callus, right below the first joint." She froze. Julian's voice remained calm. People who play regularly strings, keys, even brass, they build that up over time. It doesn't go away easily. Eliza withdrew her hand. "It's nothing. I just practiced years ago." Not seriously. He didn't press, but his head tilted slightly, as though the air had shifted. "It's never nothing, not when it leaves a mark." She didn't reply. Her hands returned to the cloth, wiping the strings in silence. He didn't move for a moment, letting the quiet sit between them like a folded note neither had read yet. Later that afternoon, they arrived at the Cleveland Museum of Art for a private fundraiser hosted by the Cleveland Arts Alliance. The invitation had come weeks ago, back when Sabrina still answered Julian's calls. Now, Eliza stood beside him in a navy dress that felt formal but forgettable, chosen on purpose. The room was filled with soft lighting, quiet music, and conversation spoken just above a whisper. Waiters in black moved through the crowd with wine glasses and canapes, the kind of space where people admired what they didn't understand and donated to what they wouldn't see again. Julian moved confidently, his hand resting gently on Eliza's forearm. She guided, not directed. Corrected his angle slightly as they stepped onto marble floors. A few guests nodded toward them. Some whispered. A woman across the gallery raised her glass a little too quickly and lost control. The wine arced downward, a sudden splash of red against the pale tile, and landed inches from Julian's shoe. Reflexively, Eliza stepped forward, arm extended, her body blocking his path. Her hand caught the stem of the fallen glass just before it rolled into his step. He stopped. The room went still. She didn't speak, just handed the glass to a passing waiter, then straightened. Julian smiled, not the tight, formal smile he used for appearances, but something more open. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "I think you see more clearly than most people with perfect vision." There was a chuckle from nearby, a soft echo of the moment. Eliza met his gaze, and though his eyes couldn't see her, something behind them responded. She smiled, for real this time. A photographer from the Westbrook Foundation's newsletter, standing across the room, raised her camera and clicked once, just as Julian reached for Eliza's hand, and she didn't pull away. It was a candid photo, a good one. Two people who looked like they belonged where they stood, even if they hadn't meant to. The image went up later that evening on the company's internal blog, highlighting community partnerships, donor attendance, and Mr. Westbrook and his wife supporting the arts in elegant form. No one questioned it. No one knew, except Sabrina, in a Manhattan brownstone with too many rooms and not enough warmth. Sabrina scrolled without urgency, wine glass balanced on her knee. Her finger hovered over the photo for a beat too long, then her eyes narrowed. She zoomed in, not at Julian, but at Eliza's hand, the way it rested lightly on his arm, not like a stand-in, not like someone playing a role, but like someone who had stopped pretending. Sabrina lowered the phone and stared into nothing. And in that long, unblinking silence, something sharper than jealousy took shape. The knock came late in the morning, 3 firm taps, too precise to belong to anyone from the staff. Eliza was in the solarium, folding laundry that hadn't needed folding. The moment she heard it, her hands stilled. She didn't need to ask who it was. A moment later, voices floated up the hallway, Sabrina's first sharp sugar slick, just loud enough to be heard without shouting. "Julian," she said, drawing out the name like it still belonged to her. Julian's voice responded, polite but clipped. "This is unexpected." "I missed you," Sabrina added, as if that were enough to justify the silence she'd left behind. Eliza stepped out of the room, her fingers brushing the edge of the doorframe. She paused at the corner where hallway met foyer. From there, she could see Sabrina standing in the middle of the entrance hall, tailored wool coat unbuttoned, her hair done like she was walking into a press interview, not a home she'd abandoned. Behind her, their mother stood quietly, her expression unreadable, polished heels, gloves, purse still hanging on one arm like a badge. Julian faced them squarely, his posture still but aware. "What brings you to Cleveland?" he asked. Sabrina smiled. "Can't a woman visit her fiancé?" The word dropped into the air like something heavier than it appeared. Eliza stepped forward then, slow but unflinching. Julian tilted his head, sensing her entrance before her footsteps reached him. "Ah," Sabrina said lightly, the understudy. Julian's brow creased slightly. He didn't speak. Eliza gave a small nod. "Hello, Sabrina, Mrs. Monroe." Their mother offered only a glance in reply, then turned her gaze back to the portraits along the wall. The rest of the day moved like a tightly drawn thread. No argument, no explosion, just a carefully measured discomfort that colored every step, every breath. That evening, Julian declined dinner, retreating to his study with a folder of reports he likely didn't read. The 3 women gathered in the west dining room. The staff had laid out grilled salmon, salad, and wine. No one touched the wine. Mrs. Monroe was the first to speak, her voice clear but flat. "You've handled things better than expected." Eliza placed her napkin in her lap. "That's not a compliment. It wasn't meant to be." Her mother's tone didn't shift. "You've served your purpose. The contracts are in motion. The funding is stabilized." Sabrina leaned forward, elbows on the table. This arrangement wasn't meant to last. You were supposed to hold the place, not take it. "I didn't take anything," Eliza said calmly. "You gave it away. That's not how it works," Sabrina snapped. "Julian is a person." Eliza interrupted, eyes level. "Not an asset, not leverage, and not yours." A pause fell over the table. Then, more quietly, Eliza added, "He listens. He remembers. He notices things most people walk right past. That's not something I'm pretending to care about." Her mother's expression stayed blank. "You're not in love with him." Eliza looked down at her hands, then up again. "I didn't plan to be." Sabrina scoffed. "This isn't a romance. It's legacy." "No," Eliza said, standing now, her voice steady. "It's just a man, and you're both treating him like he belongs in a ledger." She left the room without another word. Upstairs, Julian sat in his chair by the fireplace, a record playing quietly in the background Debussy, something slow and uneven. Eliza stepped in, not sure how much he'd heard, or if he'd been listening at all. He turned his head toward her, sensing the tension still clinging to her breath. "They came to reclaim you," she said. His mouth lifted slightly. "So, I gathered. They said, the performance is over, that I should step down now." He waited. "And what do you say?" Eliza hesitated. "I didn't come here to stay, but now I'm not sure if leaving would be the honest thing, or just the easy one." Julian didn't move. "Did they ask what I want?" "They never ask," she said. "They only inform." He was quiet for a moment. Then, finally, he asked, "Do you still want to be here?" She looked at him, at the lines on his face, the way his hand rested lightly on the armrest, fingers still moving slightly as if feeling the air or trying to hold something invisible. "I don't know if I belong," she said softly, "but I know I'm not ready to walk away." Julian turned toward the fire again, the warmth lighting one side of his face. He didn't answer. The hall at Severance Music Center gleamed like a chandelier turned inside out, walls dressed in gold trim, glass railings catching the light like facets of crystal. Eliza had never stood in a place that glittered so much without asking her to leave. But tonight, she stood beside Julian. Her dress was navy satin, modest and quiet, chosen carefully to say respectable but not showy. Her hair was pulled back, small pearl earrings, the only thing she borrowed from Sabrina years ago and never returned. Around them, the annual Westbrook Foundation Gala moved like a current. Waiters circled with champagne flutes and hors d'oeuvres. Patrons in tuxedos discussed donations like investments, and a string quartet played from the mezzanine like it didn't know anyone was listening. Julian held her arm lightly. His posture was straight, his chin slightly up, head tilting just enough to orient to sounds around him. He knew this space better than she did. He had funded half of it. And yet, she felt like she was the one seeing more. "Eliza," he said, sensing her stillness. "I'm fine," she lied. They moved toward their assigned table, where donors and board members were already seated, polished place cards, wine glasses, conversations full of old money's rhythm. One man in his 60s, heavy-set with a voice that carried, leaned in toward Julian. "She's your wife." Then he asked, "Sabrina Monroe?" Julian smiled politely. "No, she's Eliza." The table fell quiet. The silence wasn't rude. It was worse polite, confused, calculating. Eliza felt the air shift, like someone had cracked a window in winter. The man recovered. "Of course. My mistake." Then he turned back to his wine, as if the correction hadn't happened. Eliza didn't move, didn't speak. Her chest was tight, but she nodded once, enough to acknowledge the moment. Julian's hand never left her arm. An hour later, the formal part of the evening began. The foundation's director spoke first, followed by a video montage of programs they'd supported: schools, hospitals, research. Then came the children. A young girl with dark braids and thick glasses took the stage. Her white cane tapped softly as she found the microphone. The MC leaned down and asked, "Would you like to say anything?" The girl turned toward the audience, but then, unexpectedly, she turned back to the side of the stage toward Julian and Eliza. She pointed. "I hope," she said, "I can help someone one day the way they're helping me." A breath moved through the room, and then applause, real, loud, not because it was polite, because it meant something. The girl smiled, shy but proud, and for a moment, Eliza felt something ease in her chest, as if she had been holding it for years. They stayed a bit longer, until the music rose again and dessert was served. Then Julian leaned toward her and asked, "Ready?" She nodded. Outside, the valet brought the car around. Inside the vehicle, warm and quiet. Julian leaned his head against the headrest. Eliza looked out the window, lights blurred in the rain. "They still think I'm her," she said. Julian didn't answer at first. Then softly, "They don't see what I see." She turned to him. "And if one day you did," Julian's hand found hers. He didn't squeeze, just rested there. "I think I already have," he said. It began with a caption under a photograph. A simple mistake. A moment frozen at the gala, Julian and Eliza, her hand resting lightly in his. A soft smile caught in mid-turn. The image made its way to the Westbrook Foundation's internal bulletin first, then a lifestyle blog, then a national finance column titled "Westbrook's Return to the Spotlight." But beneath it all, one name repeated: Sabrina Monroe. By Monday morning, Westbrook's switchboard was clogged with calls, congratulatory, speculative, some questioning. One, from a longtime investor out of Boston, went straight to Julian's office. The man's voice was warm, almost joking. "So, the new Mrs. Westbrook is Sabrina Monroe." "Yes, just checking some of our board wondered. You know how we like things tidy." Julian, sitting at his desk, fingers drumming the edge of a braille notebook, didn't answer right away. He thanked the man, hung up gently, and sat in the quiet, as if waiting for a sound that wasn't there. Downstairs, Eliza was reviewing proposals for a youth mentorship program. Her heart jumped when the assistant delivered an envelope from Julian's office documents for her to co-sign, a standard packet, except this time, the heading was Formal Joint Founders Agreement, Eliza Monroe Westbrook, not Sabrina. She held the pen. The line where her signature was expected seemed to stretch forever. Her fingers twitched. She signed almost automatically, but the loop in her Z caught the edge of the space. Later that day, Julian asked her to meet him in the library. She walked in, still unsure whether it was better to confess or pretend. He sat near the fireplace, calm, composed, his cane resting beside the armchair. On the coffee table in front of him lay a printed copy of their marriage certificate. He reached toward it, fingers brushing the embossed paper. "This," he said, "bears the name Sabrina Monroe." Eliza didn't move. "I can't see it," he added, "but I can read what people are saying. I can feel what's been hidden." She sank into the chair opposite him, her voice low. "I'm Eliza. I didn't plan this. My mother. She zipped the dress, told me not to speak, told me this would save the family." He didn't interrupt, just sat still. The silence between them thick, but not cruel. "I wanted to stop it," she whispered, "but then I met you. And you weren't the man they warned me about. You were... you." Julian's expression didn't harden. He simply tilted his head as if he were listening deeper than her voice could reach. Then, quietly, he asked, "Do you know who created the Eliza Monroe Music Scholarship in 2015? She looked up, confused. "I did," he said. "I heard a young girl's voice in a thank you recording. Said she wanted to sing for the people who couldn't speak. I never forgot that voice." Eliza's eyes filled. The silence that followed wasn't cold. It was heavy, real. He stood up, slowly, feeling the edge of the chair, then paused in front of the window. "I don't know what comes next," he said, "but I know when someone's pretending, and I know when someone is just afraid to be seen." She stayed seated, hands clasped tightly in her lap, heart caught between exposure and something closer to relief. He didn't turn around, just let his voice drift back, soft, almost tired. She didn't look back, but he knew something had changed. The morning after Julian asked her who she truly was, Eliza packed a single overnight bag, but never left. She didn't appear in the kitchen, didn't sit across from him at breakfast, didn't join the Thursday donor call or step into his study when the board requested both their signatures. She simply disappeared from his daily rhythm, but not from the house. Instead, she returned to a part of her life that had never belonged to anyone else. The Brooklyn Heights Community Center, 15 miles from the Westbrook estate, but light years from its polish, still had the old trilingual signage, the loose carpet on the second floor, the faint smell of dried paint and paperbacks. It hadn't changed. That steadiness felt like oxygen. She asked to rejoin the reading sessions for blind children. No one questioned why a Monroe was there. They didn't know she was one. Julian didn't follow her, but in his own way, he moved. He sent word through Westbrook's legal arm to re-examine a property tied to the Monroe estate, an unused plot near Lakewood, once tied up in a foreclosure fight years ago. He remembered his father's disinterest in the land, how it had sat in bureaucratic limbo while the bank stripped the Monroe family of what little dignity was left. Julian asked for two things: quietly restore the land to community development and list the benefactor as anonymous. It was done in a day. That same afternoon, Olivia Monroe received a thick envelope in her mailbox, no note, just documents. It confirmed her debt had been settled. The mortgage tied to a speculative investment, long defaulted, had been reconciled by voluntary third-party action. She stood in the narrow kitchen of her condo, clutching the envelope, unsure whether to cry or curse. Then she placed it on the table in front of Eliza. "He didn't write a word," she said, didn't ask anything back, just made it like it never happened. Eliza held the papers, barely breathing. There was no stamp of apology, no trace of his name, just silence and action. She left before dinner, drove alone to the street she hadn't seen since her father died, South Overlook Road, where the house with the peeling blue porch still held echoes of music that never finished. Inside, dust veiled the piano like grief, left unattended. On the music stand, the sheet still sat half-written, pencil marks faded, treble clef smudged from years of heat and time. It was her father's melody, the one he'd begun the night before he fell too sick to finish. She didn't sit, not at first. She just stared at the page like it might close some ache she hadn't named. Then she reached up and touched the first note. The sound was off. Years had warped the tuning, but she pressed again. The second note, then a third. Her fingers remembered what her mind had tried to forget. She played until the melody bled into memory, until her chest shook, not from fear, but release, until the room stopped being about loss and began to feel like return. The window behind her let in the thinnest slice of late afternoon sun. It fell across the piano keys like a hand. And somewhere between the unfinished chords and the memory of her father's voice, Eliza let herself cry, not because she was lost, but because someone had quietly chosen to find her, without asking her to explain why she needed to be found. She didn't look back. But the music kept playing. Julian's voice had never needed volume to fill a room. That evening, at the Cleveland Institute of Art, the hall was packed board members in tailored suits, students in folded seats, donors in rows too polished to shift. But when he stepped onto the stage, he carried nothing in his hands. No cue cards, no tablet, not even a folded page in his pocket. The topic printed on the program was Rebuilding Through Trust. But he began differently. "My father built an empire out of steel and silence," Julian said. "He gave jobs, yes. But he also took things you can't measure on balance sheets. He took dignity. He took names off deeds, and he didn't ask if it was worth it." A hush settled. In 2009, Westbrook Industries acquired properties during the crash. There was a family Monroe whose name got buried in legal files, whose house was reduced to 3 lines in an asset column. I never knew them, but I remember the numbers. I used to be good at forgetting what those numbers meant. He paused, the shadow of the lectern cutting across his chest. "My father wasn't blind," he continued, "but he never saw anyone but himself. I followed that pattern, longer than I want to admit, until someone stood still long enough in front of me, and I had no choice but to see." There was a beat of air, stillness thick enough to feel. "Trust," Julian said softly, "doesn't begin with being right. It begins with telling the truth, even when the truth is that you didn't ask who was standing behind you while you built your own path." He stepped back from the microphone. The audience didn't move. For one long breath, it stayed frozen. Then a single pair of hands began to clap. Slow, steady. Eliza. She stood in the 3rd row, no makeup, a simple navy dress. But she looked as if the air itself shifted around her, as if something had broken loose. Others followed. Applause built slowly, then faster, like it had waited years to find a crack to pour through. Later, under the sculpture garden's soft lights, Julian found her sitting alone near the curved bench by the fountain. He didn't ask permission. He sat beside her like he had the right. She didn't pull away. "I don't know what to do with what you said in there," she whispered. "You don't have to do anything with it. I'm still not sure I've forgiven you. Or your family." He nodded. "I didn't tell it for forgiveness." She looked down at her lap. Her fingers knotted in each other. "But I don't want to forget you. I tried. I really did." There was silence between them, an old silence, but it sounded different now, like air after thunder. Julian reached into the inner pocket of his coat, pulled out a small, square device, set it in her palm. She turned it over, a digital voice recorder. "I thought I lost this," she said. "You did, on purpose." She pressed play. A soft crackle. Then a younger voice filled the quiet. Her own 16 years old, careful, breathless. To the person who believed in a girl with only 2 keys on her piano left. "Thank you for the scholarship. Thank you for making space in a world that didn't know I existed." Eliza looked at him. "You kept this." He didn't answer, just let the silence do its work. And in that still courtyard, under lights that didn't reach too far, the distance between them closed not with a declaration, not with a promise, but with a quiet recognition that some truths don't need to be explained. They just need to be heard. She didn't speak again, but Julian reached for her hand, and this time she let him. There were no microphones, no press, no donors in tuxedos, just a handful of folding chairs, a canvas banner tied to scaffolding, and the smell of fresh plaster still clinging to the air. But to Julian and Eliza, the moment felt larger than any gala they'd ever stood through. The Echolight Center had no grand entrance, just a wide doorway painted the same pale yellow as Eliza's childhood kitchen, her father's favorite color. It opened into a bright room with smooth floors, soft acoustic panels, and quiet hums from directional sound guides already wired in the corners. They'd spent weeks here together, not as husband and wife, not as Westbrook and Monroe, but simply as Julian and Eliza, 2 people laying down something that didn't ask to be admired, only to be used. That morning, as they set out brushes and trays of acrylics along the hallway, a small boy about 8 tugged on Julian's coat. "Is she your helper?" he asked, nodding toward Eliza. Julian crouched slightly, letting the boy's voice land at his level. "No," he said, "she's the one who saw me. Before I ever saw myself." Eliza stood nearby, frozen for a breath. Then she dipped her brush in turquoise and returned to the wall. They'd called it the bright wall, one full side of the activity room, left open for students, volunteers, and staff to paint or mark however they liked. Eliza had traced a wide outline of musical waves across its length, and around it, children now added their handprints, initials, and shapes only they understood. Julian worked beside her, slow but intentional. Each stroke he made was guided not by vision, but by the feedback of his fingers on the wall, the pressure, the vibration, and Eliza's gentle corrections. At one point, a teenage girl with thick glasses turned from the mural and asked, "So, is Ms. Eliza going to sing during the opening?" Laughter rose around them. Eliza didn't answer right away. She smiled, but it was the kind that tried to tuck itself away. Julian didn't hesitate. "Soon," he said. "She's just waiting for the right room." No one pushed further. Later that afternoon, the wall began to fill shapes sprawling and colors swirling, none of it symmetrical, none of it perfect, but in the center, above a painted window outlined in orange. Eliza wrote the first full sentence. "You don't need to see the light, you only need to believe it's there." She read it aloud once, quietly, then handed the brush to Julian. He didn't write. Instead, he placed his palm flat beneath the words. Just held it there, like grounding himself to something he could finally claim as his. By dusk, the center emptied out, chairs folded, paint cans sealed. But Eliza lingered in the main room, facing the mural, while Julian sat a few steps behind her, silent. "You knew that's what I'd write, didn't you?" she asked. He nodded once. She turned, then walked toward him, not fast but steady. She stopped just short of his reach. "I still don't know what this all means," she said. "You, me, this place." Julian tilted his head toward the sound of her voice. "Maybe it doesn't have to mean anything yet. Maybe it just has to feel like something worth staying with." She didn't answer, just slid down next to him, her shoulder brushing his. Out the tall windows, the yellow from the wall caught the last of the day's light. She didn't speak again, but when the breeze stirred the tarp at the doorway, neither of them moved. The afternoon air hung cool over Cleveland, laced with the scent of maple and dry leaves scattered across the concrete path leading into the Echolight. Inside, The center's small music room buzzed with soft feedback from tuning forks and the occasional laughter of children tracing sound with their palms. The final class of the day was wrapping up. Volunteers stacked chairs. Instructors handed out snacks and zipped jackets. But Thomas stayed behind. He was the smallest in the group. Thin limbs, messy dark curls, and a quiet that didn't come from shyness, but from knowing what silence felt like when no one filled it. He sat alone at the piano bench, fingers lightly resting over the ivory keys, not pressing, just remembering. Julian stepped in without cane or assistant. He knew this room. Every corner of it had been mapped through dozens of careful passes. He stood a moment, listening to the weight of breath, the stretch of stillness. "Hey there," Julian said softly, easing himself beside the boy. "You stayed late." Thomas didn't turn. "I want to learn." Julian smiled. "That's a good reason to stay. What do you want to learn first?" "Whatever song my dad used to play." Julian's fingers hovered over the keys. "Do you remember the sound?" Thomas bit his lip. His head tilted. "I don't know the name. Just that. When I heard it, it made Mom smile. Even when she was sick." Julian nodded once, silent. Then, from the doorway, a voice began to hum, low, clear, carried with a kind of reverence only a daughter could give to a melody left unfinished. Eliza didn't step in. She just stood there, hands at her sides, letting the tune thread out across the room. The tune her father wrote but never got to complete. The one buried in her childhood, stitched into every moment she thought she'd left behind. Thomas sat up. "That's it," he whispered. "That's the one Mom loved." Julian turned toward the sound. He couldn't see Eliza, but his face softened as if he could. His jaw unclenched, his shoulders dropped. The strain between memory and truth seemed to lift, if only for a beat. He joined her in the last few notes, not with words or pitch, but by placing his hand gently over Thomas's and pressing a single key. The room stayed quiet for a long time. Then the door opened again. "Ms. Monroe." Julian stiffened. Eliza's posture barely shifted. Their mother stood in the hallway, flanked by a suited man holding a briefcase. Her voice was as precise as always, but there was something fraying at the edges now. "I've come to reclaim what belongs to our family. The Monroe name still carries contracts, promises, inheritance. Sabrina's identity is legally mine to defend." Julian rose slowly, and Eliza's. The woman didn't answer. Eliza walked closer, not flinching. "You still have Sabrina, if that's who you want. But you lost Eliza the day you taught me to lie and called it love. No shouting, no tears. Just a stillness that didn't ask for permission anymore." The lawyer began to speak, but Julian raised a hand. "Whatever contract you're holding," he said, calm but steady, "won't change what I already chose." His voice didn't rise. "I chose her, not by accident, not by mistake, not because I had no one else." Then he turned to Eliza. "I chose you because I saw who you were when everyone else wanted you to disappear behind someone else's name." For the first time, the older woman looked unsure, not angry, just smaller. She turned and left without another word. The silence afterward wasn't heavy. It was whole. Thomas tugged on Eliza's sleeve. "Can I call you Mom, Eliza?" he asked. Eliza's breath caught. She glanced at Julian, at the keys, at the boy's wide, waiting face. Then she knelt down. "You can call me anything that makes you feel safe," she whispered, and the look in Thomas's eyes told her he already had. The echo in the Columbus Convention Center was not the kind that lingered warmly. It was the sharp click of polished shoes on marble, the rustle of suits adjusting in high-backed chairs, and the whisper of tension just beneath the surface. Light from the chandeliers hit the long table where 12 members of the Westbrook board sat flanking Julian, their eyes masked behind the decorum of old wealth and polished judgment. Across the country, headlines had already swirled. "Blind Air Marys." "Under false identity. Who is Eliza Monroe? Really?" The photographs showed the two of them smiling beside children, laughing in gardens. But underneath the captions, There was always one word blinking like a warning light: fraud. Julian sat still, composed. His hands rested flat on the table, one atop the other, like a man preparing to take an oath. A silver-haired man cleared his throat. "Mr. Westbrook, this board has protected your legacy for over 2 decades, but there are limits to what we can justify publicly and legally." Another voice, softer, but more pointed, added, "The marriage, the concealment, the media firestorm, it compromises investor confidence." Then the chairman leaned forward. "We are asking, respectfully, that you step aside. You may keep your name, but the company must move on. This scandal cannot define us." Julian didn't answer right away. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and placed a thin folder on the table. Before he opened it, he asked, "Has anyone here ever met Eliza, not Sabrina? Not the woman you read about in press clippings, but Eliza?" Silence. He continued. "She was told to hide behind a name that wasn't hers. Told to perform. Smile. Disappear when the lights went off. And yet, in a world built on roles and walls, she chose to stay real." He opened the folder. "This is a signed transition agreement. 30% of Westbrook's shares transferred to a new community trust. It will be governed by educators, health workers, and accessibility advocates. People who understand that legacy means nothing if it doesn't touch lives." One board member sputtered, "That's unilateral. It's binding." Julian cut in. "I had the authority. Now I've used it." The room stilled. He stood slowly, adjusting his coat. Then he faced them fully. "I didn't choose Eliza over the company. I chose the kind of company that would be worthy of someone like her. If that's not what this room wants, then perhaps I'm not the one unfit to stay." The pause hung heavy. The chandelier light above him flickered, catching the edge of his cheekbone, the quiet certainty in his blind gaze. Back in Cleveland, Eliza sat on the floor of a quiet room inside the Echolight. Her laptop rested on her knees, streaming the meeting in low resolution. The words weren't crisp, but the intent was unmistakable. His voice carried without needing to be loud. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. Her hand stayed over her mouth, and her shoulders didn't move once. On screen. Julian closed the folder, turned his back to the board, and walked slow, unhurried, toward the exit. Behind him, muffled debate began. Chairs shifted. One man's watch ticked audibly, second after second. Julian never looked back, but Eliza leaned forward, just slightly, as if hearing something in the silence that called her name. The Cleveland air carried a gentle warmth that spring morning, soft and persistent, like something finally forgiving the city for a long silence. Balloons lined the iron fence of the Echolight, tables filled with books, sensory tools, and small pots of blooming lavender. The floor of the central hall shimmered under the filtered sunlight coming through arched windows, and the music gentle, halting. Brave drifted from the fingers of children who once thought they'd never be seen. Julian arrived early. He moved slower now, not because his body had aged, but because his sight had returned in part, and with it came the hesitations of light. Shapes were still soft. Colors bled at the edges, but he saw enough to know when someone smiled at him, and enough to know when they didn't. He spent most of the morning beside the back wall, listening, letting others speak. Parents asked questions. Volunteers shared laughter. Old friends from the Monroe neighborhood came up to thank him, calling him sir too often and Julian too little. He didn't correct them. It wasn't until after the small orchestra of students finished their final song, a melody stitched from the themes of lullabies and leftover pain, that he found himself facing the center of the gallery. A single painting hung where light fell best. It showed a bridge, simple, worn stone. On one side, darkness. On the other, a gradient of soft light. And walking across it, a woman, her hand gently guiding a man who carried no cane, whose eyes looked straight ahead. Underneath, in quiet pencil strokes, Eliza. Julian did not ask who painted it. He simply stood still. His hand hovered just below the frame, tracing its presence the way he once traced faces in memory. He didn't hear Eliza climb onto the small makeshift stage, No one announced her, but when she began to speak, the room answered with stillness. My father was a man who wrote songs he never shared. She began, her voice quiet but centered. He believed music had to be perfect before the world could hear it. So, most of his notes stayed in drawers, on napkins, in his head. A pause. Then I grew up thinking that was how love worked. Two, you had to get it right before you earned the right to show it. The crowd didn't shift. Even the children who'd just played stayed frozen, watching her as if watching someone return from something far away. But someone, she said, picked up those old notes. Someone found a way to bring music into a room full of silence, not by fixing it, just by believing it still had something to say. She gestured toward the rows of students. And now they play music that will never be perfect, but it is theirs, and that means it's enough. A beat, then a voice, from the back hoarse. Older called out, because someone finally saw what the rest of the world refused to. Eliza turned her head slightly, scanning the crowd, though she knew she wouldn't see who said it. The words didn't need a face. Julian stepped onto the stage beside her. He didn't speak. He simply reached for her hand, and for the first time, he held it like it wasn't a question, but a choice. Flashbulbs clicked somewhere. The room exhaled. Behind them, the children giggled, not at them, but at the sheer weightlessness of watching grown-ups finally understand something they hadn't been taught in words. Eliza leaned slightly toward him, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "You okay?" she asked. Julian didn't answer at first. Then, barely above a whisper, "I don't need a nameplate. I don't need applause. I just want to belong somewhere where you are." She smiled small, real, and even though the applause rose again, louder this time, neither of them looked at the crowd, because sometimes the loudest home is a hand held steady in silence. It was one of those Cleveland mornings when the sky didn't make promises, but kept its stillness like a hush in the church of ordinary things. Snow hadn't yet fallen, but the air knew it would. The sidewalks outside the Echolight were damp, traced with footprints and salt dust, and the breath of winter clung gently to the glass. Eliza walked the hallway slowly. The building had changed. There were more colors now, more fingerprints on walls that used to be white, more questions scribbled in crayon, the kind only children dared to ask. She passed a line of paper stars taped to the wall. Each star carried a name and a single wish. One said, "To see my mom smile." Another, "To play music without fear." Her fingers brushed against the last one, smaller than the rest. It read, "To stay." The art room door was open. Inside, a dozen kids moved like a soft current around the tables, their steps guided by the tapping of sticks, the echo of their own sound. One of them, a girl with a high braid and wide ears, turned toward her voice. "Eliza," she asked, "where's Mr. Julian?" Eliza didn't answer at first. She pointed toward the window, out past the community garden, through the slanted panes. Julian was visible in the kitchen of the extension wing. He wore a smudged apron blue, with a hand-drawn image of a dog and a man holding a cane. The apron straps were crooked. He was laughing at something a resident had said, holding out a steaming mug with both hands, like it might spill joy. Eliza stood there quietly. She didn't call to him, didn't wave. She just looked. Then she turned back. A volunteer teacher approached, placing a small wooden box into her hands. It was sanded smooth, warm from being held. She opened the lid gently. Inside, a hand-carved figure stood still and shore a woman mid-dance, arms open, weight tilted to one foot. It was Thomas's gift, his version of her, preserved not as perfect, but as present. Next to it, folded with care, was a note she had never known her father wrote. Yellowed with time, the script was neat, hesitant in places. "My daughter, light does not sit where your eyes go. It lives wherever your heart points." Dad, her breath caught in the stillness. Not for long, just enough to feel what it meant, not regret. Not ache, but something quietly mended. The hallway buzzed again with footsteps and small laughter. In the next room, she could hear two older students tuning a guitar. A soft chord slipped through the air. Someone whispered the words to an old melody. She knew it by heart, but she didn't hum along. She didn't need to anymore. Walking past the mural wall, she stopped again in front of the bridge painting, now framed behind protective glass. Below it, a new brass plaque had been mounted. It didn't name the artist. It didn't name the figures. It simply said, "The way forward is never just about the eyes. No applause, no declarations, and no need to correct anyone who didn't understand what came next." Because that morning, no one asked what they were now: husband, wife, partners, friends. The people at Echolight knew better. They knew names weren't always needed for what had been chosen, what had been built, what had stayed. Outside, the wind shifted, not sharp, not loud, but enough to nudge the chimes hanging at the porch. They sang just once, then quiet again. Eliza looked out at the snowless trees, her arms folded. They didn't need to be the same to walk the same road. They just needed to be looking the same way. There's a quiet that settles in places, built not with marble, but with effort, slow, imperfect, human effort, like the sound of fingers finding keys on an old piano, or a voice choosing to stay when it could have turned away. Some bridges aren't rebuilt with grand gestures, just footsteps, small ones, in the same direction. Maybe love doesn't need to declare itself. Maybe it just leaves a light on and waits. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough.